Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really famous thought experiment, Pascal's wager.
Right, the one that sits at that interesting crossroads of, well, faith and rational calculation.
Exactly. You sent in some great material, and the plan is to really dig into it, understand the core argument for believing in God, maybe not based on proof, but pragmatism.
Precisely. It comes from Blaise Pascal, 17th century French thinker,
Yeah.
brilliant guy, mathematician, scientist, philosopher.
A real polymath.
Totally. And his wager isn't about proving God exists, not directly anyway. It's more like a practical case for belief.
Okay.
The basic idea, and we'll unpack this, is that even if you think God's existence is, like, super improbable, the potential upside of believing is so massive, infinitely good, supposedly, that betting on God becomes the rational move.
Infinite upside. Okay, that's a big claim. So the sources break this down.
Yeah, into roughly 3 versions or stages of the argument. There's the argument from superdominance, and the argument from expectations, and finally, the argument from dominant expectations.
Sounds like a progression.
It is. And underlying it all is decision theory. You shared some background on that, which is helpful.
Right, the lottery ticket example seemed useful.
Yeah, it's a good illustration. You've got possible outcomes: win big, win small, lose your dollar.
Each with a certain value or utility to you.
And a probability of happening.
Yeah.
You multiply the utility by the probability for each outcome, add them up.
And that gives you the expected value of buying the ticket.
Exactly. Decision theory says, basically, go with the action that has the highest expected value. That's the rational choice.
So Pascal is taking that framework.
And applying it to the biggest question of all. Should I believe in God?
Okay, let's start where he starts. The argument from superdominance. What's the essence of that first step?
So Pascal sets up this simple 2x2 grid, like a table.
Okay.
On one axis, you've got God exists or God doesn't exist. On the other, you believe or you don't believe. 4 possibilities.
Simple enough.
Now the payoffs. If God exists and you believe, reward. Infinite happiness. Heaven, essentially.
Right. The jackpot.
If God exists and you don't believe, consequence. Infinite punishment. Or at least infinitely bad.
Ouch. Okay.
Now, if God doesn't exist, well, if you believe, maybe you missed out on some worldly fun, but maybe you gained some peace of mind, community. Let's call it a finite outcome. Could be slightly positive, slightly negative, but definitely finite.
Okay, not infinite either way.
And if God doesn't exist and you didn't believe, you also get some finite outcome. Maybe slightly better than the believer in this scenario, maybe slightly worse, depends how you value it, but still finite.
Got it. Finite versus infinite.
So look at the grid. If God exists, believing gets you infinity, not believing gets you negative infinity. Believing is way better.
Clearly.
If God doesn't exist, both believing and not believing lead to finite outcomes. Let's say they're roughly comparable, or maybe one is slightly better than the other, but the difference is finite. So Pascal says, look, in the God scenario, belief wins infinitely. In the no-God scenario, the difference between believing and not believing is only finite. Therefore, across the board, belief superdominates non-belief. It's either infinitely better or, at worst, finitely different.
So the argument is, no matter what the reality is, you're better off believing.
That's the conclusion of this first argument, yeah. Belief is presented as the dominant strategy.
And notice you didn't even mention the probability of God existing yet.
Exactly. That's key for the superdominance version. It doesn't rely on odds at all, just on the infinite stakes if God does exist.
Wow. Okay, what's your gut reaction to that? Mine is, it feels a bit, I don't know, cold, like gaming the system.
That's a very common reaction. It feels transactional, maybe even cynical to some. And Pascal, well, he moves on to refine it.
Which brings us to the argument from expectations.
Right. Now we bring probability into the picture. Let's say, just for argument's sake, you reckon it's 50-50. 50% chance God exists, 50% he doesn't.
Okay, assigning odds now.
So calculate the expected value of believing. It's 0.5 times positive infinity plus 0.5 times some finite value.
Which is still infinite, right? Half of infinity is still infinity.
Mathematically, yes, it trends towards positive infinity. Now, the expected value of not believing, 0.5 times negative infinity, plus 0.5 times some other finite value.
Which goes towards negative infinity.
Precisely. So even with 50-50 odds, the expected value calculation overwhelmingly favors belief. Positive infinity versus negative infinity.
So introducing probability doesn't really change the outcome here because the infinities are just so powerful.
They dominate the calculation. And that leads straight into the third version, the argument from dominant expectations.
Which basically says The exact probability doesn't matter much.
Pretty much. As long as you grant there's some non-zero chance, however tiny, that God exists.
Like even 0.000001%.
Even then, multiply that tiny probability by an infinite reward, and the expected value for belief still rockets towards positive infinity.
As long as the outcomes in the no-God scenario remain finite.
Exactly. The infinite reward, even if improbable, dominates any finite considerations on the other side. So the expected value of belief is always infinitely higher than non-belief, assuming that non-zero probability and those infinite stakes.
Okay, that lays out the core logic pretty clearly. Infinity is doing a lot of work here.
It really is. It's the engine of the wager.
But, as you hinted, this whole line of reasoning, well, it's attracted a lot of criticism over the centuries.
Oh, definitely. It's far from universally accepted.
One of the big ones mentioned in the sources is the intellectualist objection. Can we actually choose what we believe?
Yeah, this hits at a really fundamental point. Is belief, like, voluntary? Can you just decide, okay, starting now, I believe X?
The source gives that example.
Yeah.
Try believing the sky is green because someone offers you $1,000.
Right. It feels impossible. You can say you believe it, you can act like you believe it, but can you genuinely make yourself believe something you find counter-evidence?
Seems unlikely. Our beliefs usually feel like they're formed by evidence or experience or intuition, not just sheer willpower.
So the objection is, if belief isn't voluntary, the wager asks us to do something we can't actually do. It's like telling someone to choose to be taller.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
How do defenders of the wager respond to that? Because it feels like a pretty serious roadblock.
It is. The Pascalian counter-argument is quite clever, though. They often concede that, yeah, maybe you can't directly will yourself to believe in an instance, but they argue you can choose to perform actions that make belief more likely over time.
Like what?
Like, you can choose to read scripture, hang out with believers, go to religious services, try praying, avoid skeptical arguments. Essentially, immerse yourself in a belief-forming environment.
Ah, so it's indirect. You choose the path, not the destination itself, but the path might lead there.
Exactly. They compare it to other things. You can't just decide to be fluent in French, but you can decide to take classes, practice, live in France, actions that cultivate fluency. Belief, they argue, might be similar.
So the choice isn't believe now, but start acting in ways conducive to belief.
That's the idea. You choose the means, which are voluntary actions, hoping they lead to the end state of belief.
The source also mentioned another angle. Even if belief isn't fully voluntary, if ending up in a state of belief is pragmatically better overall, maybe that's enough.
Yeah, that's a more straightforward pragmatic defense. It basically says, look, however you get there, voluntary or not, if believers are better off according to the wager's calculations, infinite reward versus infinite punishment, then being a believer is still the preferable state, even if how you got there is complicated.
Okay, so that's the response to the can we choose belief problem. But then there's another huge one, the many-gods objection.
Ah, yes, this is maybe the most famous criticism, often attributed to Diderot.
And the core idea being,
Pascal's wager seems to assume a choice between basically Christianity, or the specific god Pascal had in mind, and atheism. But what about all the other gods or religions?
right, what if you bet on Pascal's god, but the actual god is, say, Allah, or Zeus, or some god we've never even heard of?
Exactly. The source lays this out clearly, sometimes with table. If Yahweh promises infinite reward to believers and infinite punishment to others, and Allah promises the same,
then betting on Yahweh leads to infinite punishment if Allah is real, and betting on Allah leads to infinite punishment if Yahweh is real.
it turns the wager from a seemingly safe bet into, well, a minefield. Believing in the wrong God could be just as disastrous, infinitely speaking, as not believing at all.
Yeah, it suddenly looks like a terrible gamble with potentially infinite downsides no matter which specific belief you choose.
It really complicates the neatness of the original 2x2 grid. The crucial insight here is that the wager itself doesn't give you a reason to pick one specific god over any other that might also offer infinite rewards or punishments.
So how do Pascalians deal with this one? The sources mentioned a few different tacks.
They do. One approach is called genuine options.
Meaning?
The idea is that maybe we shouldn't consider all possible gods. Maybe only certain theological options are live or genuine possibilities for a given person or culture.
But who decides what's genuine?
Exactly the problem. As the source points out, this risks being arbitrary, based on prejudice or just cultural familiarity. How do you objectively rule out certain gods without just assuming your own framework is right?
feels like it could easily become circular or biased. What else?
Another idea is runoff decision theory. This involves like a two-stage process.
All right.
Maybe first you use regular reasons, evidence, philosophy, arguments about coherence, whatever, to narrow down the field of plausible belief systems. Get rid of the ones you think are clearly false or contradictory.
So an epistemic filter first.
Right. Then, if you're left with a few options that seem roughly equally plausible based on evidence, then you use Pascal's wager, the pragmatic argument, to choose among those finalists.
Or maybe the other way around. Use a wager to decide to believe in some kind of God and then use evidence to pick which one.
That's the other variation, yeah. But both versions have issues, as the source notes.
Yeah.
Well, how do you justify excluding possibilities in that first epistemic stage? What counts as enough evidence to rule something out, especially when dealing with, ultimate reality?
Tricky.
And if you use epistemic reasons at all, doesn't that kind of undermine the whole point of the wager being a purely pragmatic argument, independent of evidence? If you already have good evidence for God X, why do you need the wager?
Yeah, it muddies the waters between pragmatic and epistemic justifications for belief.
Yeah.
Feels like you might be trying to have your cake and eat it too.
It's a definite tension there.
Then there was the relativism idea, that maybe the wager worked better in Pascal's time.
The argument being that maybe back then the main perceived choice really was just between Christianity and atheism, so the many gods problem wasn't as obvious.
But the source kind of shot that down, didn't it?
Yeah, pretty quickly. Historians point out that even in the 17th century, educated Europeans were aware of Islam, Judaism, classical paganism, and reports of other beliefs from around the world. The idea that it was just a simple binary choice isn't really historically accurate.
Fair enough. So what's the last defense against many gods? Generic theism.
Right. The idea that, okay, maybe the wager doesn't get you to a specific god, but perhaps it's rational to bet on the existence of some kind of supreme being or higher power.
Kind of hedging your bets at a more general level.
Sort of. Maybe believing in a god, any god, is better than atheism. Hoping that whichever god turns out to be real will appreciate the general effort, perhaps.
But even that runs into trouble, right?
Yeah.
The source brought up some interesting counterexamples.
It did. One is the professor's god.
Which is?
Imagine a god who actually values intellectual honesty, skepticism, and evidence-based reasoning above all else.
Okay.
Such a god might actually punish people who believe based purely on the self-interested calculation of the wager, rather than a genuine search for truth.
Huh. So betting on belief to save your skin could be the very thing that damns you, if that God exists.
Exactly. It turns the wager's motivation on its head. The nature of the divine is unknown, and assuming it rewards belief based on self-interest is, well, just another assumption.
That's a clever counter.
Yeah.
And there was another point, too, about non-theistic systems.
Right. What about belief systems like, say, some forms of Buddhism, where the goal isn't worshiping a creator god, but achieving enlightenment or liberation, perhaps even by transcending the need for belief in gods?
Ah, so in that framework, adopting a theistic belief based on the wager would actually be detrimental.
It could be seen as an obstacle, yeah. So even the generic theism approach doesn't universally make belief the best bet, depending on what ultimate reality might actually be like.
Wow. Okay, the mini-gods objection seems really persistent and hard to fully resolve for the wager.
It's widely considered one of the strongest objections, definitely.
Let's move to the next one, the evidentialist objection.
Sure.
This seems to question maybe the morality or intellectual virtue of it all.
Yeah, this shifts from pure logic to ethics and epistemology, the theory of knowledge. The core idea is it okay, is it intellectually or even morally right to believe something just because it seems beneficial rather than because it seems true?
Believing for advantage versus believing based on evidence.
Exactly. And there are sort of two flavors to this objection. One links back to what we just discussed.
The professor's God.
Right. God might actually disapprove of belief, motivated by self-interest. What if God values sincerity or faith that arises from love or conviction, not from a cost-benefit analysis? Believing via the wager might be seen as, well, contemptible by such a God.
So it's epistemically irresponsible and potentially counterproductive depending on the God.
That's one angle. The other angle focuses less on God's potential reaction and more on our own intellectual standards.
How so?
The source mentioned philosopher G.E. Moore calling it absolutely wicked to believe based on self-interest. The argument is that we have a kind of duty, or at least an intellectual virtue, to base our beliefs on the best available evidence and reasoning, regardless of potential rewards or punishments.
Like truth-seeking should be the primary goal, not maximizing personal utility.
Yes. It connects to broader ethical debates. Is the right action always the one with the best consequences, like utilitarianism, which might align with the wager's thinking? Or are things like intention, duty, and intellectual integrity important in themselves, more like Kantian or virtue ethics?
So the wager's pragmatic approach clashes with ethical views that value truth and sincerity intrinsically.
Precisely. It raises deep questions about what genuine belief even is and what kind of intellectual character we should aspire to.
Okay, one final category of objections. The paradox objection. This sounds like it challenges the mathematical or logical framework itself.
Yeah, this one gets a bit more technical, questioning whether decision theory can actually handle the infinite values that are so central to Pascal's wager.
How does infinity cause problems?
Well, one issue is the equiutility paradox. Imagine there's a tiny, tiny chance that brushing your teeth correctly aligns the planets in just the right way to grant you infinite bliss in the afterlife.
Okay, bit far-fetched, but for the sake of argument.
And imagine there's also a tiny chance of the same infinite bliss even if you don't brush your teeth. If you plug infinities into standard decision theory, the expected value of brushing and the expected value of not brushing both become infinite.
So, they're equally good. Brushing your teeth is just as rational as not brushing them, in terms of expected infinite utility.
That's the paradoxical result. It seems absurd. If any action has even a minuscule chance of leading to infinite reward, decision theory might suggest all such actions become equally infinitely valuable, making meaningful distinctions impossible. Infinity kind of flattens everything out.
It breaks the scale, making finite differences irrelevant.
Right. And then there's the related, more famous St. Petersburg paradox.
I've heard of this one, the coin flipping game.
That's the one. You flip a fair coin. If it's heads on the first toss, you get $2. If tails, then heads, $4. If tails, heads, $8, and so on. The pot doubles each time until a head appears.
So potentially huge payouts, but less likely the longer it goes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, mathematically, the expected value of playing this game, summing the probability of each payout, multiplied by the payout amount, turns out to be infinite.
Infinite expected winnings.
Yeah. 12, $2 plus 14, $4 plus 18, $8 plus Pagler plus $1 plus $1 plus Secplate, which sums to infinity.
Tough wait. No rational person would pay an infinite amount of money or even a huge finite amount to play that game once, would they?
Almost certainly not. Our intuition screams that paying, say, $1 million for one round is crazy, even though the mathematical expected value is infinite.
So what did that tell us?
It highlights a potential disconnect between the formal calculations of expected utility theory and our intuitive sense of rational decision-making, especially when infinities or potentially unbounded payouts are involved. It suggests the standard model might break down or need refinement in these extreme cases.
And the connection back to Pascal's wager is?
The wager relies heavily on these infinite values to drive its conclusion. If the very framework of decision theory struggles to handle infinities coherently, as suggested by these paradoxes, then the foundation of the wager itself might be shaky.
Even if you try to say the rewards are just arbitrarily large but finite, the St. Petersburg paradox suggests problems even then.
Exactly. Relying on these extreme, potentially infinite stakes within standard decision theory to justify something as profound as religious belief becomes problematic. It questions the robustness of the calculation itself.
Wow. Okay, well, this deep dive has certainly covered a lot of ground. We started with what seemed like a fairly simple, pragmatic argument.
Pascal's initial pitch, yeah.
But unpacking it, and especially looking at the criticisms, reveals just layers and layers of complexity.
Yeah.
Questions about choice, evidence, morality, other religions, even the limits of rationality and math itself.
Absolutely. It's one of those philosophical arguments that just keeps generating debate. While Pascal offered this a seemingly straightforward calculation based on infinite reward,
The objections pile up pretty quickly.
they do. Can we choose belief? Which God? Is it ethical? Can decision theory even handle infinity properly? These aren't easy questions.
So ultimately, this exploration doesn't really land on a simple yes or no to the wager, does it?
Not at all. I think what it does is give us a much richer appreciation for the sheer difficulty of applying rational frameworks to ultimate questions about faith, existence, and the unknown. It shows the tension points.
So thinking about all this, the core wager, the paradoxes, the ethical concerns, the many gods problem, what's the final thought you're left with? Does Pascal's pragmatic bet hold any water for you personally as a compelling reason to believe? Or is its main value now more as a brilliant thought experiment that shows us the limits of trying to calculate our way to faith?
It's definitely something to mull over. Which arguments felt most convincing or most troubling, and why? There's no single answer.
And I suppose if this has piqued anyone's interest.
There's so much more out there. Reading Pascal's original Pensées, diving deeper into decision theory, exploring the philosophy of religion. It's a fascinating landscape.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for unpacking that with me.
My pleasure. It's always a mind bender.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.